um, and to be able to utilize it and share with your network. So let's get started. Thank you for joining us for our community business workshop. Business is unusual contracts during the COVID-19 crisis. The community business workshop series is made possible with the generous support of FUMG Union Bank. The Community Business Workshop Series is a collaboration between the Polski Exchange, the IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship, and the Office of Civic Engagement. The goal of the series is to provide Southside businesses and entrepreneurs with substantive and active and actionable programming to grow and sustain their businesses. In this workshop, we will discuss how contracts are interpreted when a crisis outside of the party's control makes it impossible to proceed as planned. We will talk through practical tips for negotiating with landlords during the coming weeks, and we will talk about how you can craft future contracts to plan for the unpredictable. I would like to introduce you to our speaker, Beth Kregor. Beth is the director of the IG Clinic on Entrepreneurship. Under Beth's guidance, University of Chicago law students take their first steps into the practice of law by providing legal advice to lower income entrepreneurs. Prior to joining the IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship, Beth practiced law with Sidley Austin Brown and Wood for several years with a focus on intellectual property litigation. I wanted to just make a quick disclaimer. The information provided by the Polski Center and our speakers for general informational purposes only and is not legal advice. You should not solely rely upon the material or information on the webinar as a basis for making any business or legal decisions. This presentation does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. Some housekeeping items. If you have questions, please enter in the chat box on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once we wrap up the webinar, we will leave some time to answer your questions. With that being said, I will pass it on to Beth.
Thank you so much, Isra. Welcome everybody, good evening. I was thinking I might see a gallery full of faces, but I see that that you're all hiding from me. But good evening. This is a community of folks. There's some faces. This is a community, whether we can see each other or not. This is one of the ways that we do build community and interact with each other in the community business workshop. So it's really nice to be with you in this virtual weird way tonight. My name is Beth Kregor. I am the director of the IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship, which is at the law school at the University of Chicago. We're lawyers and advocates and watchdogs and boosters for low-income entrepreneurs. And we try to live up to that mission in a number of ways. We take on a small number of clients and serve as their general counsel. We have outreach events and workshops like this. We run the Southside Pitch every year. So we're thinking about what that might look like in the new world we're living in this fall. And we're really out there to be a watchdog to figure out if some of the laws are making it difficult or even impossible for the folks who have big dreams and small budgets. So we're eager to provide information to make things easier for small businesses, but also hear and learn from you all when the law is getting in your way. So with that, I'm sure many of you have been on Zoom or in front of a computer almost all day. I know I have. One of our clients at the IJ Clinic on Entrepreneurship runs the Haji Healing Salon, and she would make sure that I reminded you that self-care is important. You might want to take a stretch or something. It's also important before learning something new or taking in kind of a new packet of information to think for a second. Even a second makes a difference, kind of about what your intention is. What do you want to get out of this? And for anybody who wants to spend a second thinking about that, feel free to drop something in the chat, just a word or two about what it is that you're hoping for, what your goal is for this session, and wishing might make it so. So thank you for being here. I'm going to get on to the meat of the presentation. Here we go. Let's see. share my screens. Now you should see my face and maybe some other windows at the side of your screen. You can choose at the top of those little boxes whether you just want to see the speaker or a few different folks. So our topic today, as Isra introduced, is business as unusual. I'm going to talk about contracts during this crisis that we're all living through. So let's see here. To begin with, I want to acknowledge that it sucks. This is a difficult, trying time. It's particularly grueling for the small businesses in our community. We know that we are here to do what we can to support you all and to help you to think creatively and to work through this. That is what entrepreneurs do so magnificently well. So I didn't want to just launch into this without acknowledging that probably a lot of folks in the group are having a really hard time with this. And I really hope that I can give you some kind of actionable information to help you see a path forward, and that you share with us what additional questions you have that you think we can answer. All right, so what I plan to do going through this material today is first I'm going to talk about how leases work during a pandemic. What does it mean to have a lease? Even if you don't have a lease, maybe you've been working from home even before you were ordered to, that section of the session will still be really relevant because what I'll be describing in terms of a lease could be applied to a lot of different kinds of contracts. Then we'll move on to thinking about if you're stuck with the language in your lease, how can you negotiate with your landlord to find a workable way forward? Again, whether or not you're dealing with a lease, those kinds of negotiation tactics should be relevant to you too. And then lastly, talk briefly about other kinds of contracts and how they might be different and how they might be the same as a lease. All right. So this seems to be really slow when I click the button to move the slide. There we go. So starting with a lease. We know that so many small businesses, so many big businesses have had to shut down during this time period, either by choice to protect themselves or their employees or by order. And certainly there are some storefronts that are still open, but their entire financial situation has changed drastically. So what do you do with a lease in that situation? One question you might be asking is, if you're not using your space, do you still have to show up there? Do you ever have to go there anymore? And I want to note that you might still be responsible for maintaining that space. It's often the case in a commercial lease that the tenant is really responsible for a lot of maintenance and upkeep, much more so than you might be used to in a residential lease. And sometimes that even extends to the outside of the building. So you may need to fulfill those obligations. You might need to check out the space, make sure it's safe and all together. One of my clients showed up in her space to discover that she'd been flooded from a plumbing snafu upstairs. So you don't want for that to happen and not to be known about for a long time, because that's going to come back to bite you. It is, even if your business is considered non-essential and you're not supposed to be operating your business, you are allowed to go and make sure that everything is secure and safe. And on this slide, I list the fact that essential travel allows you to conduct the minimum necessary activities to maintain the value of your business's inventory, to preserve the condition of the business's physical plant and equipment, to ensure security, and so forth. And it also allows you, the order, both at the state and city levels, allow you to do whatever is necessary in your business location to facilitate being able to work from home. So you can check the mail, you can pick up the things you need in the place of business, so you can keep on working at home. Now, it might not be possible or feasible for you to be checking on your business very often as you think it needs to be done. It might be risky for you if you're suffering from the consequences of COVID in your household, or you're particularly vulnerable. So that's something to think about as you try to reduce your risk and fulfill the duties that you took on in your lease. You might want to talk to neighbors or your landlord to figure out how to make sure that that business area stays safe and secure. Now, moving on to the big looming question: do I have to pay rent? That is a pressing question for all small businesses, all renters, all around the country, of course. And there is no single answer to that question. As with any question about a commercial relationship, the answer is you got to look at your contract. The answer is it depends, which can be a frustrating answer to receive, but unlike the relationship between a landlord and a tenant in a home, in a residential situation, where there's a lot of law that determines what the landlord can and can't do and what the tenant's rights are, in the commercial setting, it all comes down to the contract. It's assumed that the business tenant and the landlord have negotiated and agreed to that contract, and that's almost always what's going to rule. So first answer is look at your lease. The government has ordered a moratorium, a stop on evictions, including commercial evictions. So that means that your landlord cannot use the sheriff to kick you out of your space because you haven't paid rent. But that does not change the fact that you may owe rent, and that owed rent is piling up month after month if you're not paying. So what can you do? Next question: could my lease itself contain something that excuses me from paying rent? Possibly, and we'll talk about some of those possibilities, but not probably. It's less than likely that that a commercial lease would excuse your rent payments in a situation like this, but it is possible. So let's walk through that. So the way a lease works, almost always, is it sets up kind of what, of course, the obligations of the tenant are and what the obligations of the landlord are, and then it kind of lays out what counts as a default. When has the tenant done something out of compliance with the duties of the lease such that it's a default, or kind of breaking the lease? And then it will also lay out what the landlord might do that would be a default. And then it explains what can happen, what the remedy is when there's a default. So often, paying rent late or not paying is a default. And if it might be once, it might be twice, it might be 3 times, it might trigger the landlord's right to terminate the lease, or to do something else. Sometimes the landlord can't do anything unless the landlord reminded you, gave you notice that you were late on the rent. So that's something to keep track of. You should also always look at what the landlord's defaults are. It could be that the landlord has to keep the building open And the landlord has to comply with the law and be a legal landlord. And that's the landlord's responsibility. And in this current situation where the landlord cannot keep that building open legally, the landlord's in default. So that might be something to look at. But usually you gotta pay your rent, and if you don't pay your rent, that's a default. So next step is let's look to see if defaults are excused under extraordinary circumstances. We're certainly living through extraordinary times. All right, so here we're getting into this question of force majeure, this glamorous French phrase. So sometimes the commitments in a contract or even the whole contract are excused or kind of canceled if there are extraordinary circumstances outside the party's control. I included a little comic here of a corporate lawyer's idea of fun, thinking that the conference was a costume party and dressing up as force majeure. But force majeure clauses deal with disasters. Sometimes they're referred to as acts of God, things that are often unforeseeable, or even if they're, we know they might happen sometimes, we don't know when, we don't know how they're going to come and what they're going to do. So these things often include things like crazy weather, earthquakes, lightning strikes, sometimes strikes, people strikes, labor strikes, riots, things that make it impossible for one of the parties to deliver on the contract, and they just had no way to stop it or even know it was coming. But so leases do not very often say that a tenant does not have to pay rent if one of these unforeseeable extraordinary events occurs. It can happen, but it's not frequent. And sometimes even when you have a force majeure clause, it doesn't list something that would describe the pandemic or the stay-in-place order that we have now as a trigger for canceling parties' responsibilities under the contract. So let's think about those things in a little more detail. So I went back through a number of leases that we've worked on in our clinic, leases that small businesses have signed in Chicago, and I've seen these force majeure clauses come up occasionally. So we've seen it come up just to benefit landlords. It might not surprise any of the folks on the call. Landlords are often the ones in control of the lease. They're often the ones who write it, and a lot of times tenants don't have much bargaining power to change it, or maybe even much knowledge to know what to negotiate for. So some leases might tilt really heavily toward the landlord. And this is an example. It says that whenever a period of time is prescribed in this lease for action to be taken by the landlord will not be liable or responsible for any delays due to strikes, riots, acts of God, shortages of labor or materials, war, applicable laws, or any other causes of any kind whatsoever, which are beyond the reasonable control of landlord. So if the lease says the landlord has to fix your collapsed ceiling in 30 days, but something outside of the landlord's control came along and the landlord couldn't get to it in those 30 days, then the landlord is excused. You can see here, this is typical of a force majeure clause, that it lists a number of examples like strikes and riots, labor shortages, material shortages. That's an interesting one. And then at the end it says, or any other causes. It has some kind of catch-all because the nature of unforeseeable events is that they're hard to list in a contract. All right, we've seen it in leases for our clients for all due dates except rent. So there I've included an example of a force majeure clause in a lease. It applies to both parties, and it allows for delays. It forgives any kind of delays for any due dates. If the delays are due to strikes, riots, acts of God, shortages of labor, and any cause beyond the party's reasonable control. But it has that important except word in there, except for the payment of money by tenant. So that's not what you're hoping to see when you're looking for a language in your lease that allows you to skip paying rent or delay paying rent during this pandemic. We've seen it in leases where it applied to anything, a wide variety of causes outside of people's control, but it's specifically said, but it doesn't apply for financial causes or if someone just has a lack of funds, that's not the kind of disaster that that language is supposed to address. Now, we have seen it apply to tenants. I did find one example, and it's a long one. We don't have to go through the detail, but I think if you, we'll share these slides with all of you so you can look back over them. You might notice, if you look closely, that the landlord has a longer list of reasons that would excuse delays than the tenant does. But the tenant does get a few in. So the tenant will not be deemed in default if its performance was delayed or made impossible due to civil disorder, external riots and insurrections, terrorism, war, acts of God, or any other causes beyond the reasonable control of tenant. Now, you look at that list that applies to the tenant and you think, okay, is the pandemic in there? And it's not explicitly in there, unless you think the pandemic is an act of God. And you might want to look at how courts have interpreted that language for a long time, or else you're arguing that it falls into this catch-all, any other causes beyond the reasonable control of tenant. Now, certainly the pandemic has been out of your control, and it has made your performance probably impossible, or at least arguably impossible. But again, you have to argue for that interpretation. It's not laid out there specifically. So what can you do if you find that that force majeure clause that you're looking for when you're reviewing your lease? What do you do? Well, first, I want you to look carefully for notice requirements. Do you have to tell your landlord that you are invoking that force majeure clause and you're relying on it? Is that the only way it works for you? You've got to look at the list of triggers. That's what I was just talking about in the last example. Is there a nice hook you can hang COVID-19 on as an excuse that triggers that force majeure clause? Maybe it includes regulations or governmental orders or a change of the law that was outside of your control and made performance impossible. Maybe it includes some kind of public health emergency, or maybe it's got that kind of catch-all and you can argue that it covers COVID-19. But you are going to have to figure out why that applies to you, and you're going to have to prepare to show how this pandemic was not foreseeable and it actually caused your inability to meet your obligations. And that's where it gets a little trickier. The order, the law of the government may certainly cause you to stop selling clothes because the government has ordered you to stop selling clothes because if they're considered non-essential. But the government hasn't ordered you to stop paying rent. There are a couple links in that chain to explain how the pandemic has made it impossible for you to pay your rent. So it's not a straight and easy path to walk. And lastly, you really just want to communicate with your landlord. You want to let your landlord know what you're thinking. You certainly want to work it out and not rely on a long process in court where the judge decides whether or not the force majeure clause in your contract applies or not. All right, another question, can I terminate my lease? Can I just walk away? You may not be thinking that you're going to resume your business in the same way, in the same place anytime soon. You might rather just close the chapter on this lease. Again, you got to read your lease. Read that termination clause. Pay special attention to what it says about what you have to let your landlord know and when, if you're planning to walk away. You might want to check if your landlord is in default. If your landlord is no longer supplying a place where it's legal for you to do your business, maybe your landlord is in default. Maybe that gives you an option to terminate the lease with lighter consequences than you'd see otherwise. Oftentimes, if you just say, I'm done, I'm out of here early, you're breaking your lease early, there's a general notion in the law that the landlord can't just sit around and ask you to keep paying rent for the next 2 years or whatever's left on your lease. The landlord's supposed to try and find someone else to pay the rent. But right now in Chicago, that's a hard thing to imagine. I think any landlord's going to be hard pressed to find a new tenant. So it's going to be hard for you to argue that you're just making way for someone else and that the rent will be coming from another source. All right, so it's tricky. This hasn't been a super rosy prognosis for what you can do about your lease. So the real focus here, I think, for most commercial tenants in Chicago and all around the country is going to be on negotiating. Your landlords know what's going on. Your landlords are worried about what's going to happen to you and whether or not they're going to be looking for new tenants. And they may be very open to having a conversation about how you can work together to come up with something, some kind of plan. So I think a lot of your focus for a lease and really for lots of different ongoing contractual relationships that you might have and might be wondering about how you can keep up because of all the interruptions to your business. I think, you know, talking to folks, negotiating, figuring out a solution that works is really an important thing to keep in mind. So very basic, universal negotiating strategies. Step one, think about your goals. You know, what do you hope to achieve? What do you absolutely need to achieve? And you can use those goals, what you'd love to achieve in your highest hope and what you absolutely need to achieve to figure out kind of what your bargaining range is and what you should ask your landlord for somewhere in that range. You should also always, before negotiating, think about the other guy. What's the other guy looking for? What are your landlord's goals and needs? You can imagine that your landlord is worried about the mortgage and keeping up with payments on that building too. There's a whole stream of payments in this kind of business setup, from your customers to you, from you to your landlord, from your landlord potentially to a bank. So think about how that's playing out for your landlord. What does your landlord need? What does your landlord hope for in the relationship with you? What can you offer the landlord that the landlord's looking for? So you always want to think carefully about both sides of the deal, and that's the way you can figure out how you might find some solutions that work out for both of you, or at least sting a little less. And then step 3 is to think about ways you can convince your landlord that your goals can align. So with that, we're about halfway through, and I'm going to change it up a little bit. So if you're wandering around, if you're doing other stuff and listening to this in the background, I'd ask you to come on back and join us, because I'm going to put you in some small breakout groups so that you can talk to one another. So here's the plan. We're going to break you up into small groups of, I think, 4 or 5, and maybe 6. I don't know, Israel, what you want to do. She's manning the breakout button. And this is what I'm going to ask for each group. It's just going to be a few minutes for you to get to know each other a little bit and work through some of these ideas together. It's always nice to turn your camera on to have a little face-to-face, but that's not always possible. I know some folks aren't prepared to be in front of the camera right now. But here are the 3 things I'm asking you to do. First, discuss what might motivate a landlord to lower, postpone, or cancel rent payments. What can a tenant use in a negotiation like this that will make the landlord think this is worthwhile? I should relax the rent. So that's step 1. Discuss what might motivate your landlord. 2, put it into practice. So 2 people in the group are going to play one tenant, one landlord, and have a quickie conversation as if they were negotiating. Now, I think it's important to actually try it. It might feel silly to do that role play, but it really helps to actually put yourself in that seat and put the words together instead of talking about it, actually saying what a tenant might say to a landlord and what a landlord might say to a tenant. And then the other folks in the group can give some helpful feedback on the negotiation that happened. And then lastly, you're going to pick one person from the group to write a #1 tip in the chat when you're back. So it might be a tip about thinking about something or researching about something about your landlord. It might be a tip about negotiating or what you'd emphasize in that negotiation. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. So don't worry over it, but we're gonna send you into those breakouts. Again, I don't think you're gonna see this slide, so I'm hammering at it before we send you off. Discuss what might motivate the landlord, do a little role play and give some feedback, and then decide on what tip you wanna share with the group when you're back. All right, Isra, can you break about?
Yep, so people should have gotten invitations. If you don't want to be in a group, you don't have to join. So we have about 4 groups.
I think we've just been kicked out of the breakout rooms, Beth.
Okay, great. Welcome back. If the person you designated in your group can type up a little tip for the rest of us in the chat, that'll be great. Then we can all benefit from the multiple groups. All right, and with that, we'll keep on trucking through the presentation. Let's see here. All right, so continuing this discussion of how you might go about renegotiating your lease. I helped with some other folks around the university and in consultation with a major landlord, one of the biggest in the country, who has lots of malls and big places like that. We put together a very simple document for amending your lease. So it's going to take work on the part of the tenant and the landlord to start the conversation, to have the kinds of conversations you guys were just strategizing about in the breakout groups. But if you can come to an agreement, we hoped to make it really easy to get it down on paper. It's on the website centerforrisk.org/lease. And again, you're going to have this PowerPoint presentation in your email after today's workshop, and we'll also give you a copy of this form lease. Try to make it as simple as possible. Of course, as with any contract, you can tweak it, and the time period might not be in line with what you have discussed with your landlord. But there are just a few blanks to fill in, really, with the tenant's name, the landlord's name, and then kind of the biggest variable in the way we set this up is the percent of rent that would be postponed. And then we laid out that the rest of the rent that wasn't postponed or deferred would just be forgiven and not owed at all. So here's that key paragraph from this simple document. The tenant is not required to pay rent under the lease when it is due in April, May, and June. That's the relief period. And then you can negotiate to fill in that percent that would be owed later. So X percent of the total rent that is owed during the relief period is deferred. And tenant shall pay the deferred rent in 6 equal payments along with regular rent in January, February, March, April, May, and June of 2021. So the idea here is that the tenants would have some time to get back on their feet. The idea here, of course, we don't know what the timeline is going to be, but this is laid out for the idea that the tenant's going to need relief for April, May, and June. It's going to need time after that to get back, hopefully full speed. And then starting in January, the tenant could kind of add on some payments, some extra payments to cover that rent that was postponed in the spring. And then it specifies that the rest of the rent that is owed during the relief period is forgiven and not owed at any time to landlord. Here's just a little screenshot of the website that where you can find this lease. You can read an op-ed that was in the Wall Street Journal talking about how important it is that landlords and tenants come together and have an easy way to have these conversations and to document their agreements. Maybe you have a landlord that would be motivated by the opinion of some professors that's in the Wall Street Journal. So that might be helpful. But then you can download the Word document for that lease so that you can alter it for your agreement and your needs. And then the website has some FAQs right there. So if some of the words don't seem familiar to you or you have questions about how it would work, hopefully that website will answer your questions. All right, so that's what I had specific to leases. Some of the provisions you can look for when you're reviewing your lease to figure out whether you need to keep paying rent. You've got to look at what counts as default for the tenant, what counts as default for the landlord, and what happens when there is a default. And you look for that force majeure clause, try to figure out if it applies, and how you can talk to your landlord about that if it does, or if you think it does. And then finally, how to think about renegotiating. You may be wondering about all sorts of other kinds of contracts. Certainly relationships with employees and independent contractors and workers of all stripes are, at the top of mind for small business owners everywhere. I'm not going to focus specifically on employment issues here, but talking generally about other kinds of contracts that you might have with your suppliers, with your customers, really kind of business to business contracts you might have as well. So again, we're going to go back to that force majeure idea. Look for a force majeure clause in any written contract you have that you're wondering about. Maybe you're fine and you're expecting something, but you're wondering if the other guy is going to beg off the commitment. Or maybe you're thinking, I cannot do what I said I would do, and I need to figure out what happens next. You want to really know what the force majeure language is in your contract. Here's kind of a little checklist again to go over what we discussed before. You look for it in your contract. It might not be called force majeure. It might be called acts of God or extraordinary circumstances, or it might just be kind of included in the language about termination or breach. So you really want to look carefully for that. You want to check whether it covers the pandemic that we're living through right now. The more explicit that language is, the more clear it is that it's covered in that list, the easier it is to just negotiate person to person with the other party to the contract. And I think that, some force majeure clauses in some contracts refer to epidemics or public health emergencies. Those are obviously right on point, but I think much more common, what you might find language about changes in the law or government orders that make it impossible or illegal to keep going with the contract. Again, as with the leases, it's harder to prove that whatever that disaster was made it impossible to pay someone, even though we know realistically it does. But sometimes the cash payments are not excused. It's more obvious that it's impossible to make widgets if the government says you're not allowed to make widgets, or it's impossible to make scarves for next winter if people aren't allowed to come to work, or if you can't buy the supplies you need to make those products. So always check notice provisions. That's one takeaway that applies to this situation, but you should plant in your brain for whenever you're looking at your contract and figuring out what it means for a certain situation. It's very often that that there are very important notice provisions. They can be easy to overlook, but oftentimes the clock doesn't start ticking on somebody else's obligation to fix a problem unless you give them notice. And sometimes it has to be written notice, and sometimes that written notice has to go through the mail to a specific address. You really want to pay attention to that. You want to keep good records and really keep them, make them and keep them about exactly what is happening in your business, why you are unable to fulfill the promises in the contract, and what you've done to try to work around it. You want to kind of be building that case. You don't want to end up in court arguing over whether this force majeure clause applied to you, but the more prepared you are to tell a story later, the better off you'll be in negotiations. I'm trying to avoid a court case, and certainly the better off you'll be if that's where the question gets resolved. Try to figure out workarounds. You want to be able, of course, to work around the problem, but you also need to explain, if you end up in court, why you could not work around it, and it was not in your control. And lastly, once you've really figured out kind of where you stand, you want to contact the other party and talk it over. You also might want to review your contract for language about the inability to perform for other reasons. Sometimes contracts anticipate that it will be hard to do these things because of the supply chain or changes in the law. So there may be language in there that's not set up exactly like a force majeure clause, but provides some kind of action plan when it just becomes impossible. And then lastly, I see we're kind of running out of the planned time, but I'm certainly sticking around for questions. What if your contract doesn't have force majeure or impossibility clause? Maybe you don't even have a contract in writing at all. If you sell goods, there's a whole set of background rules called the Uniform Commercial Code. So this isn't if you sell services, not if you sell coaching or training sessions or massage, but if you sell hats and gloves or food, potentially these background rules come into play. And they say people are excused from performance if it's impracticable because of unforeseen circumstances that are out of their control, or because they're complying with a law. Now, those are harder, kind of more obscure legal arguments to make, so it's a little harder to just work that out with the other party, but there's something you can work through there. Sorry that they're shaking hands in the clip art I included in the slide. That's a no-no. And then if you're not selling goods, a court might still excuse performance in those kinds of situations where the law has made it illegal for you to go ahead and do what you were doing, or you're supposed to be painting a house and there is no house. But again, you don't want to rely on what would happen in a court. So again, my primary advice is to use those kind of negotiation tactics that we discussed. Start a conversation. Some major companies may already have COVID-related relief policies. I've heard that you kind of have to use the magic words. If you're calling your credit card company and you say, I can't pay on time, they might not help you. But if you say, I cannot pay on time because of COVID-19, that might open up some assistance. Smaller businesses might have policies in place of forgiving certain obligations too. Sometimes you'll find that your counterparty needs to change things up because they're in a bind as well. If you're worried about delivering goods for them to sell, but they can't sell them, maybe you both need to back off the original plan. So you're all entrepreneurial. That's what brought you to Polsky or to the IJ Clinic and to this workshop tonight. And that is the most important tool to rely on as we all are trying to navigate these unpredictable and uncertain times. And then final note, if all else fails, just breach. You might just have to break your contract. And what does that mean? Well, your contract might have something to say about what that means, but in the end, the other party might have to take you to court to make you pay the damages, and that might be a risk worth taking. So then lastly, what should I do in the future? You may have some ideas already. You may have already resolved to negotiate force majeure clauses in future contracts. If you're entering into a contract right now, the possibility that COVID-19 might put a wrench in the works is definitely foreseeable. So you want to mention that explicitly. And really try to think what are the things that might happen that would make it really difficult for me to meet my obligations in this contract, or get what I'm relying on here, and try to make a plan for them. It's never fun to talk about those when you're getting together for a new exciting business deal, but it's so important to talk earlier rather than later. And another tip for the future is to talk to your insurance agents about what happens in those worst case scenarios. If you have business interruption insurance, you want to really understand when it comes into play and when it doesn't. So many people have been distressed that the business interruption insurance they thought would come to their rescue during this period of time is not. There are a lot of cases in the courts already trying to push insurance companies to provide insurance for business interruption in this scenario. There's states talking about writing it into the code, requiring insurance companies to pay up for business interruption insurance right now. The Small Business Advocacy Council in Illinois is working on that question here if you're interested in getting involved in that effort. So with that, we've reached and passed the hour mark, but I'm very happy to stick around and welcome all of you to stick around if you've got the time to hear some questions if we've got any, and you can put them in the chat.
Thank you, Beth. That was wonderful. I learned a lot, and I'm hoping you guys can all benefit from the information. We are taking in questions, so if you have a question, feel free to just enter it in the chat box. Okay, so we got a question. If you're a contractor like a home remodeler, and you can't fulfill your side of the deal, example, can't repair the floor in 1 month. Also, you didn't include a force majeure clause in your contract with the client. Are there any laws that protect you from the client taking you in court?
So right now, there's not a specific law, I think, saying that you're not responsible for the delay. But this landscape is evolving very quickly. So right now, the home remodeler would be considered, I think, an essential worker. He's allowed to continue working, but may not want to. For any number of reasons, may not be able to for any number of reasons. So I think it's always best to talk to the customer. The customer may be flexible with timing for, self-interest reasons, and may be understanding at the very least of the reasons that business can't fulfill that time limit. If it does get to the point where you've got a stubborn customer who won't budge and does take that home remodeler to court, I think that's where the law might come in and the court would say, it was impossible or it was impracticable for this business to meet that deadline. The customer would also have to prove how they were damaged by the delay. If it didn't really hurt them other than that they wanted it done and it was written in the contract that it was done, they're not going to get very far in court. So for anyone in a situation like that with a party on the other side that is threatening suit and just cannot, will not bend, on deadlines and obligations. Start assembling really, really good records about everything you tried to do to accommodate, to work around the problem, and all the reasons why you couldn't. So if your workers are calling you and saying, look, I can't work that job today because my daughter is sick, or because I live with an elderly relative and I can't risk being out there and exposing myself. We can't do the job unless we're close together, and I won't take that risk. If that's a phone call, you got to write it down. Got to build up those written records in real time so that you can really make the case that you couldn't do it and it was because of these circumstances that were outside of your control.
Thank you. Next question. Any advice for dealing with a big company instead of a person for renegotiating? It seems like persuasive negotiation only works when there can be a good dialogue, which is very difficult to do with a property rental management company.
That's a very useful question. So I think a lot of negotiation is done by Twitter these days. It's something to think about. A big company is, question number 2, I think, or step number 2 that I laid out in thinking about this negotiation is what is your landlord's goals? When you're thinking about a big company, one of their goals might be keeping up appearances, keeping a positive public reputation. So that's a tool you should consider, and that is a reason that I think a lot of big companies are developing policies to be flexible, to be forgiving. As I said, I worked on that form lease with one of the biggest landlords in the country that has all sorts of malls. They're worried about the small businesses that hold their leases. They're worried about them surviving through to the end. They want to help. They want to be seen as a good landlord and a good citizen at this point in time. So they're internally working on developing those policies. It's always possible, again, kind of like the answer to the last question, that you're dealing with a big company that is just full speed ahead. We're not budging. We need this money from you month after month. And there, I think that the tricks are to find the person who can negotiate and to keep asking to be bumped up the ladder of your contacts until you can talk to someone who actually can negotiate, and figure out diplomatically if you can deploy the public reputation against them. If that's where they would feel it, they're not worried about losing you as a tenant. They're not worried about you going under. They're not worried about any of that. They still might be worried about their reputation. And so those are some of the tools that I would suggest using in that negotiation.
Thank you. We have another question, but I think it might be a better fit for our previous sessions in terms of access to capital. But could you speak a little bit about mortgage options as a borrower? Are the options similar to rentals?
Yeah, so there I think you're more likely as a small business owner dealing with a big party on the other side, if you're talking about the bank that holds your mortgage. And there, again, I would fall back on the idea that a lot of these big companies are ahead of this. They have policies in place. They are anticipating that people aren't going to be making their payments. They've kind of figured out what they're going to do. They're less likely to perhaps to negotiate specific terms person by person, though I'm not sure about that. But I think using those magic words, contacting them and saying that you would like some accommodation, or some forgiveness, some flexibility because of COVID-19 and the effect it's having on your business, or the governmental orders related to COVID-19 and the effect those are having on your business, you might trigger kind of an automatic relief policy. If not, then I think you'd follow the tip I gave in response to the last question of trying to go up the chain and find someone you can actually negotiate with, which is always hard with these big bureaucracies.
Thank you. Can you explain the cost-benefit analysis commercial landlords are considering right now with respect to commercial eviction? What does the eviction process entail for a landlord and a tenant in an office property or non-grocery retail property?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a moratorium right now. So they wouldn't be analyzing whether or not to do it right now, but they certainly might be thinking about whether or not they would do it when the moratorium is lifted. And that's why I think it's important to try to come to terms with your landlord and actually get it in writing, so that they can't claim in 6 months that you were in default and start going down that road. So it's landlords are in a tough situation, depending on kind of how they're financed and how they're leveraged. Some of them, as I mentioned earlier, are absolutely dependent on the rent checks coming in so that they can pay their debts. And the answer to the previous question about whether or not a mortgage is going to have any wiggle room is going to be very relevant to a lot of landlords. So I think they're thinking of that. They're thinking about the bills they've got coming due. I think they're also thinking about how hard it might be to re-rent the space. I think there are lots of projections right now about vacancies going up. Retail space has been hard to fill for many years now, and so I think it's safe to predict that a lot of landlords are going to want to hold on to tenants rather than shooing them away and counting on getting another paying tenant. I'll qualify that, flip-flopping a little bit, by saying there are some incentives that people have been concerned about for some time now for landlords to have vacant property, because sometimes that gives them tax breaks. And there are some people working on reforming those tax rules locally so that landlords don't leave property empty on purpose and charge overly high rents on purpose so they can just keep it vacant. The process for a commercial eviction is a court process. I don't know all of the ins and outs of it. The process for a residential eviction, I do know, is very slow and has a lot of requirements, and it's very difficult to evict a residential tenant. I doubt that the commercial process is nearly so rigorous and restrictive, but it would certainly involve lawyers and process and time and delay. So that's going to go into the cost benefit analysis too. And Isra, that's the last question I see in the chat.
Yep. So we'll wrap up. I know we have one more slide that Beth, you wanted to share, but thank you everyone. I found this webinar super helpful, and just as a reminder, the Community Business Workshop is a series of workshops that are geared towards small businesses and entrepreneurs. So we host these workshops once a month. The next one will be on May 20th. That will be a Wednesday, same time. The topic will be building an empowering team. And we'll have Awatif Yahya, who has years of experience working with executives, businesses, and founders on how to cultivate a strong, empowering team. In the meantime, I wanted to express my gratitude to Beth. Beth put up this presentation last minute, and she was super excited to present, and just wanted to show my gratitude to her. So really excited, and our thoughts are with you, and we'll keep on posting content and helpful tips. We do have a resource page, so please go to polsky.uchicago.edu. And when you go to our Polsky website, there's a bar where you can see a link to our resources. You just click that link and it'll automatically take you to tons of resources. So we have financial resources for small businesses and entrepreneurs, mental health support resources, informational support resources, and we worked really hard with our partners here at the university to build those resources. So feel free to take a look at it. And Beth, if you want to have some final words to share before we wrap up.
I'm grateful to you all for spending this evening with me. It's a beautiful sunny evening, and you're here to learn. This was my first webinar, so I'm happy to get your feedback and learn more about what you need from the IJ Clinic. But one thing that we have already offered is shopandplaceshy.com, and I wanted to let you all know as potential customers, but certainly as business owners who might be a good fit for this site. It lists businesses that are still open to sell the things that we need to stay home and stay healthy, ranging from soaps to fitness classes online to books and games that might entertain our kids while we're trying to work. And so we'd love for you to check it out, see if there's some new small businesses local here in Chicago that you might want to patronize, but also if your business is a fit for the site, you can submit it right there and add it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
All right, take care, everybody.